MAATUBUNTUMAN, the Black Radical Imagination of Pan-Afrikan Unity. Welcome to the 10th episode of Yɛresiesie, the Preparation for Reparations podcast. I'm your host, Esther Xosei, Executive Director of the Maangamizi Educational Trust, the educational arm of the Stop the Maangamizi campaign. Joined once again by my co-host, Brother Simeon. But let us first pour libations. We pour libations to the Creator of the heavens and the earth, and our African ancestresses and ancestors who envisioned unity when division was imposed upon us. To Asajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, whose words Pan-Africa and not Euro-Africa should be our watchword, still guide our path towards continental liberation. To Patrice Lumumba, whose dream of Congo sovereignty lives on in today's liberation movements. To Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the Garvey movement, including Amy Ashwood and Amy Jacques Garvey, who imagined global African unity when it seemed impossible. To the revolutionary African women freedom fighters who fought for our liberation, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, who resisted Portuguese colonialism, Nahanda Chawe Nyasakikana, the spirit medium who led resistance against British colonialism in Zimbabwe, to Fumilayo Ransome-Kuti, who organized Nigerian women against colonial taxation and oppression, to Professor Wangari Maathai, who connected environmental restoration to political liberation in Kenya, to Mama Winnie Mandela, who sustained the struggle against apartheid, and Dedan Kimafe's comrade, Field Marshal Mutoni Wakirima, who led Mau Mau fighters in the forest of Kenya. To all the visionaries who dared to imagine Maat Ubuntuman before the word even existed. We pour to the Alliance of Sahel States and all contemporary freedom fighters forging liberated zones across our motherland. May our words honor their sacrifices. May our vision manifest their dreams. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo.
Greetings, family. In our previous two-part series on the Black Radical Imagination, we explored how visionary capacity has historically sustained liberation movements and examined practical approaches to cultivating this imaginative power for reparations work.
Yes, and today we turn our focus to one of the most profound expressions of the Black Radical Imagination in contemporary reparations organizing. Maat Ubuntuman. This concept, endorsed by the Stop the Maangamizi campaign and emerging from the visionary work of PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, and the Global African People's Parliament, GAP, represents the ultimate strategic goal of African reparations, a Pan-African union of communities rooted in our ancestral wisdom, yet adapted for contemporary liberation.
This focus on Maat Ubuntuman connects directly to our podcast's central theme, Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves for reparations. Because Maat Ubuntuman isn't just a distant dream, but a concrete vision that must guide our preparation today. How we organize, educate, and build power now determines whether we'll be ready to establish and sustain this Pan-African Union when the conditions become favourable.
Exactly, Brother Simeon. Today we'll explore how Maat Ubuntuman represents the crystallization of centuries of Pan-African visionary thinking, examine its philosophical foundations drawing from Maat, Ubuntu, and Oman traditions, and discuss how contemporary liberated zones like the Alliance of Sahel States, serve as building blocks towards this ultimate goal. All of this is preparation work, developing the consciousness, structures, and practices we'll need for Pan-African unification.
What makes this discussion particularly timely is that we're witnessing real-time examples of African sovereignty movements that embody elements of Maat Ubuntuman vision. The Alliance of Sahel States isn't just challenging neo-colonial control, they're demonstrating what genuine African self-determination looks like in practice, providing concrete lesson for broader Pan-African unity.
And this connects to the fundamental understanding that Maat Ubuntuman isn't a utopian fantasy, but a strategic necessity. The continued fragmentation of African peoples serves colonial and neo-colonial interests, while our unity represents the greatest threat to systems of exploitation and domination. Therefore, preparing for Maat Ubuntuman is preparing for the most comprehensive form of reparations possible, not just compensation for past harms, but the transformation of power relations that created those harms.
The vision of Maat Ubuntuman. Auntie Esther, for our listeners who may be encountering this concept for the first time, could you explain what Maat Ubuntuman means and how this vision emerged from contemporary reparations organizing?
Sure. So Maat Ubuntuman is a revolutionary concept that represents the envisioned future, or should I say emerging, Pan-African Union of Communities. The name itself is profound. It's coined from the conjunction of three fundamental African philosophical concepts. Ma'at, the holistic justice concept from Kemet, ancient Egypt; Ubuntu, which is the Bantu concept of the communion of humanity from the southern African region; and Oman, the African concept of an egalitarian polity from West Africa.
This philosophical synthesis seems profound, but how can our listeners begin to understand and embody these principles in practical ways?
That's the essential question, Brother Simeon. I want our listeners to start by examining their own daily practices. When you make decisions, whether in your family, your workplace, or some other place in your community, are you asking the Ma'at questions? What is true? What is just? What creates balance? And what promotes harmony? Let me give you a concrete example. The next time you're in a meeting where people are arguing, instead of trying to determine who's right or wrong, ask yourself, how can we find the truth that honors everyone's experience? How can we create a solution that brings justice for all involved? This is practicing Ma'at principles in real time. And for Ubuntu, the next time you face a personal challenge, ask yourself, how does this affect not just me, but my community? How can addressing this challenge strengthen our collective well-being? This shifts us from individualistic to communal thinking. So I challenge our listeners for the next week, try to apply one principle of Ma'at and one insight from Ubuntu to your daily decisions. Notice how this changes not just your choices, but your entire way of seeing situations. What's particularly significant is that we're seeing concrete manifestations of this vision emerging today. For example, the Maatubuntu Jama, African Heritage Community, for national self-determination in the United Kingdom represents the kind of autonomous organising that prefigures MAATUBUNTUMAN, while Sankofa Homes serve as Pan-African community regeneration local zones of rematriation spaces that connect local community building with global Pan-African liberation.
This philosophical foundation you're describing seems to draw from what Sylvia Wynter calls being human as praxis, the understanding that how we organize society shapes what it means to be human. MAATUBUNTUMAN appears to be imagining new forms of human organization based on African rather than Western philosophical traditions.
Yes, this vision emerged from the collaborative work of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, PARCO, in conjunction with the Global African People's Parliament, GAP, and has been adopted by the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, as well as the Global African Family Reunion International Council, otherwise known as MAATUBUNTUMAN GAFRIC. What's crucial to understand is that MAATUBUNTUMAN has been adopted as one of the key rallying objectives of the Pan-African Reparations for Global Justice. This isn't separate from reparations work, it is reparations work. The vision recognises that the most comprehensive form of repair for the Maangamizi is the total liberation, unification, and self-determined progress of the continent and her diaspora of Africa as an integrated whole.
This connection between reparations and unity seems fundamental. Could you elaborate on why Pan-African unification is understood as a form of reparations rather than a political goal?
The Maangamizi, which is the intentional destruction and dispossession of African peoplehood, nationhood and relationships to ancestral lands through chattel enslavement, colonialism and contemporary neocolonialism, deliberately fragmented African peoples. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 didn't just partition our continent, it severed relationships, disrupted knowledge systems, and imposed artificial divisions that continue to serve colonial interests today. Therefore, genuine reparations must address this fundamental harm of fragmentation. MAATUBUNTUMAN represents the restoration of African unity that colonialism tried to destroy, and elevated to a new level that incorporates both our ancestral wisdom and contemporary possibilities. This is what we mean by reparations as transformation rather than compensation.
This seems to connect to what Walter Rodney analysed in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, his understanding that African development was deliberately stunted through fragmentation and resource extraction. Maat Ubuntuman appears to envision reversing this underdevelopment through unity and self-determination.
Precisely. Rodney's analysis demonstrates that African underdevelopment wasn't natural but imposed through systematic exploitation that required our disunity. MAATUBUNTUMAN envisions ending this exploitation through comprehensive unity, not just political but economic, cultural, educational and spiritual. The vision promotes what we call Ubuntu Dunia, a combined Nguni and Kiswahili word meaning a multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice for all. But this goes beyond traditional multipolarity towards what scholars call pluriversality, a decolonial vision where diverse cosmologies, epistemologies and ways of knowing coexist not in power hierarchies, but in relationships of collaboration and cooperation. This anti-imperialist, decolonial, pluriversal world will be established by the successful reparations and sovereignty restoration struggles of the world's peoples. This represents a fundamental challenge to the global system that continues the Maangamizi in contemporary form.
The organisations you mentioned, PARCO, GAP and others, seem to represent a generation of Pan-African organising that's both globally connected and locally rooted. How does this approach to Pan-Africanism differ from earlier movements?
Contemporary Pan-African organising builds on the foundation laid by earlier movements while incorporating lessons from both their achievements and limitations. Organisations like PARCO and GAP maintain the anti-colonial vision of leaders like Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, Amilcar Cabral, Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, and Ayo Keita, who worked for federation across French colonial territories in West Africa and opposed the artificial borders imposed by colonialism. While developing more sophisticated analyses of gender, class and other intersecting forms of oppression. This represents a more holistic approach that addresses multiple dimensions of liberation simultaneously, recognizing that genuine Pan-African unity requires challenging all forms of oppression within our communities, not just external colonialism.
And how does this concept of MAATUBUNTUMAN specifically address the global dimension of African oppression? The reality that African people face exploitation not just on the continent, but throughout the diaspora.
MAATUBUNTUMAN explicitly envisions a global African polity that transcends the artificial separation between continental and diaspora Africans imposed by colonialism. The vision recognizes that whether in Ghana, Detroit, London or Sao Paulo, African peoples face manifestations of the same global system of exploitation and therefore require a unified response. This is why organisations like the Vazoba African Friends Networking Open Forum and MAATUBUNTUMAN Gafrik are all working towards MAATUBUNTUMAN from different locations. They understand that fragmentation serves our oppressors, while unity serves our liberation.
This philosophical synthesis you described, bringing together Maat, Ubuntu, and Oman, seems to bring together what Edward Said called contrapuntal reading, bringing different traditions into dialogue to create new possibilities. How do these concepts work together in the MAATUBUNTUMAN vision?
This philosophical synthesis creates a comprehensive framework for organising society that challenges Western individualism and materialism. Ma'at provides the spiritual and ethical foundation, the commitment to truth, justice, balance, and harmony as organising principles rather than profit and domination. Ubuntu contributes to social philosophy, the understanding that individual well-being is inseparable from collective well-being, and Oman refers to the political structure or form of governance systems based on consensus and community participation rather than elite domination. Together, these create what we might call an integral African worldview. This offers some genuine alternatives to both capitalist and state socialist models that have proven inadequate for African people.
This integration of different African philosophical traditions seems to anticipate what Akili Mbembe planetary entanglement, the recognition that our liberation is connected to global transformation rather than narrow nationalism.
Exactly. Maat Ubuntuman isn't about African isolationism or supremacy, but about African people taking our rightful place as equals in a multipolar world. The vision explicitly commits to harmonious relationships with other peoples while ensuring that Africans have the power to determine our own destiny. This connects to Frantz Fanon's call in The Wretched of the Earth for the Global South to create new models of human organisation rather than simply imitating Europe. MAATUBUNTUMAN represents exactly this kind of creative response to the challenges of decolonisation.
You mentioned that Maat Ubuntuman has been endorsed by the Stop the Maangamizi campaign. How does this vision connect to the campaign's broader strategy for reparations?
The Stop the Maangamizi campaign's endorsement of Maat Ubuntuman represents the recognition that stopping the ongoing harm of the Maangamizi requires not just addressing its symptoms, but transforming the global power relations that sustain it. Individual reparations, while important for some, cannot address the systemic nature of African oppression without collective transformation. Maat Ubuntuman provides the strategic vision that guides all of our reparations work in the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, from community education through Maat Zoa Zajuras to international advocacy for recognition of the Maangamizi and the need to stop it. Every activity is evaluated against the question: does this advance us towards the Pan-African Union of communities that we envision? This is why the campaign emphasises both stopping the harm and advancing the vision as inseparable aspects of reparations work. We cannot achieve Maat Ubuntuman while the Maangamizi continues. But we also cannot stop the Maangamizi without the power that unity provides.
Liberated zones as building blocks. You've emphasized that Maat Ubuntuman isn't just a distant goal, but requires concrete building blocks in the present. Could you explain how liberated zones on the continent and autonomous spaces in the diaspora serve this function?
Liberated zones represent what have often been called counter-hegemonic spaces, areas where oppressed peoples begin practicing alternative forms of organisation while building the power to expand them. In the context of Maat Ubuntuman, liberated zones serve as laboratories for the governance, economic and social systems that will characterise the Pan-African Union. On the continent of Africa, we're witnessing the emergence of sovereignty movements that explicitly challenge neocolonial control and begin implementing genuinely African approaches to development. These liberated zones fulfill what Asajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah envisioned in his famous book, Class Struggle in Africa, where he wrote about the necessity of creating liberated territories as foundations for continental liberation. The Alliance of Sahel States provides the most dramatic contemporary example, but similar processes are occurring throughout Africa as communities reclaim control over their resources and governance.
The Alliance of Sahel States, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, provides a particularly instructive example because they're not just rejecting French colonial control, but actively building alternative regional institutions. Their approach seems to embody both the prefigurative politics we discussed in the previous episodes and Nkrumah's vision of liberated zones as stepping stones to Pan-African unity. The Alliance of Sahel States provides such a concrete example, but many of our listeners might wonder, how does this connect to my daily life in London, New York, or Sao Paulo? What can we learn from their approach?
This is such an important question because it addresses the challenge of connecting global liberation movements to local or global organising. The Alliance of Sahel States teaches us several principles that apply anywhere African people are organising. First, they demonstrate that we don't have to accept the terms offered by oppressors. Our listeners should ask themselves, what terms are you accepting in your life that you could or should reject? Maybe it's the assumption that you have to compete with other African people for limited opportunities, or that you have to choose between cultural authenticity and professional success. Second, they show us the power of principled unity across differences. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have different languages, different colonial experiences, different economic challenges, but they found common ground in opposing neocolonialism. I want our listeners to reflect, who in your community could you build principled unity with? Or should you build principled unity with? Even if you don't agree on everything, what shared values could become the foundation for collective action? Finally, they demonstrate that sovereignty means making decisions based on your own values rather than external approval. Ask yourself, in what areas of your life are you seeking validation from systems and power structures that don't serve you? How can you begin making decisions based on African values rather than colonial expectations? And they're also developing regional institutions based on African rather than imposed external models. Their mutual defence agreements, trade relationships, and governance structures draw on traditional African approaches to inter-community cooperation while adapting them to contemporary conditions. Precisely the kind of institutional innovation Kwame Nkrumah advocated. And also, they're committed to education systems that centre African knowledges and languages, rather than continuing colonial educational models. This represents the kind of epistemological decolonisation that MAATUBUNTUMAN requires and that Nkrumah saw as fundamental to genuine liberation.
Their rejection of the CFA franc and movement towards alternative currency systems seems particularly significant. This challenges what many consider the most important tool of French neocolonial control in West Africa.
The monetary sovereignty you're highlighting is crucial because the CFA franc system represents one of the most sophisticated forms of contemporary colonialism. By requiring African countries to deposit 50% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury and linking their currencies to the euro, France has maintained economic control even after formal political independence. The Alliance's movement towards monetary sovereignty, whether through alternative regional currencies or other mechanisms, demonstrates the kind of bold action required for genuine independence. This prefigures the economic integration that MAATUBUNTUMAN envisions on a continental scale.
How did diaspora communities contribute to the process of building towards Maat Ubuntuman? The geographic dispersion seems to create different challenges and opportunities than continental organizing.
Diaspora communities play essential roles in building towards MAATUBUNTUMAN through what we call non-territorial autonomy, or they can, let me say. And this is by creating autonomous institutions and practices that don't require geographic concentration, but still advance collective self-determination. This includes organisations like the Global African People's Parliament in the UK, which has been creating spaces for diaspora Africans to develop independent political analysis and organise collective responses to both local and global manifestations of the Maangamizi. And this non-territorial autonomy is envisioned by the Stop the Maangamizi campaign through initiatives like Maat Ubuntu Jammers. And these are autonomous, Pan-African, or what we would say African heritage communities based on the principles of Ma'at. And they are connected with organic initiatives of the same type on the continent of Africa called Sankofa Homes, which are Pan-African liberated zones and local zones of rematriation, that is, returning to our motherland on the continent of Africa, that serve as building blocks of the emerging Maat Ubuntuman. So therefore linking community building that transcends the colonial borders, that is, the existing colonial borders, and ethnicities and nationalities of colonization.
These diaspora initiatives seem to serve multiple functions, maintaining connection to African identity and values while building organizational capacity that can support continental liberation movements.
Exactly. The diaspora serves as what Marcus Mosiah Garvey overstood as a strategic reserve for African liberation, providing resources, knowledge, and solidarity that complement continental struggles. Garvey recognized that diaspora Africans, while facing oppression in their locations, often had access to industrial skills, financial resources, and political networks that could support continental liberation movements. His vision of the Black Star Line and other economic initiatives was designed to channel diaspora resources towards African development and advancement while building the organizational capacity needed for eventual rematriation or sustained solidarity. But this requires moving beyond colonial charity models towards genuine partnership in building unified liberation movements. Garvey's concept of the diaspora as a strategic reserve emphasized reciprocal relationships where diaspora communities gain political consciousness and organizational experience through supporting continental struggles, while continental movements benefit from diaspora resources and international solidarity. And these can be all kinds of resources. The Pan-African Reparations Rebellion groundings that we've been discussing throughout this series create spaces where continental and diaspora Africans develop shared analysis and coordinate action rather than work in isolation.
The concept of Sankofa, learning from the past to build the future, seems particularly relevant to how these liberated zones function. They are not just trying to recreate historical African societies, but adapting their principles to contemporary conditions.
Yes, Sankofa is fundamental to the MAATUBUNTUMAN vision because it avoids both the trap of romanticizing the past and the trap of uncritically adopting Western or Eurocentric models. Liberated zones practice what we might call critical traditionalism, that is, studying historical African governance, economic and social systems to extract principles that can guide contemporary institution building. For example, traditional African approaches to consensus-based decision-making inform how the Stop the Maangamizi campaign has been structuring our notion of assemblies, Pan-African People's Assemblies, which are adapted to include participants across continents through also use of technology, and which incorporate contemporary understanding of the need for gender equity and other issues of intersectionality.
How do these liberated zones and autonomous spaces coordinate with each other? The vision of Maat Ubuntuman seems to require not just local organising, but systematic connection across different sites of struggle.
Coordination occurs through several mechanisms that prefigure the communication and decision-making structures that MAATUBUNTUMAN will require. The global assemblies of African people's power provide one framework for connecting struggles across different locations while respecting local autonomy and initiatives. Additionally, with the campaign, that is the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, it creates shared political frameworks that allow different organisations to coordinate action around common goals while maintaining their specific focus areas and constituencies.
The Alliance of Sahel States seems particularly significant in this context because they're demonstrating exactly the kind of contemporary resistance to neocolonialism that you're describing. Their actions seem to embody principles of sovereignty and self-determination by challenging French colonial control while building solidarity with other global self-liberation movements.
Precisely, the Alliance of Sahel States represents the contemporary historic importance of the resurgence of colonized African people against the forces of neocolonialism for national self-determination and Pan-African sovereignty. They're not just pursuing narrow nationalism, but they're contributing to the multipolar world of global justice that Ubuntu Dunia will usher in. This multipolar vision is crucial to understand because it fundamentally challenges the current unipolar world order dominated by Western powers, particularly the United States and its NATO allies. Under unipolarity, a single power center dictates global economic policies, military interventions, and cultural norms. The Alliance of Sahel States is actively dismantling this by rejecting the CFR franc system, expelling Western military bases, and building partnerships with countries like Russia, China, and other global South nations on terms of equality rather than dependency. However, we must understand that while multipolarity represents an important step towards de-Westernization, it still operates within power differential frameworks where nation states compete for influence and resources. The rules of the game don't fundamentally change. There are simply more contenders for dominant positions.
This distinction between multipolarity and pluriversality seems crucial for our listeners to understand. Can you help them think through this difference in their own organising contexts?
Absolutely. I want our listeners to pause and reflect. When you engage in political organising or political work, are you primarily trying to gain more power within existing systems? Or are you fundamentally questioning how those systems operate? This is the difference between multipolar and pluriversal thinking. For example, if you're working for better representation in existing political institutions, that's important but essentially multipolar, seeking more equitable power distribution within current frameworks. But if you're creating alternative decision-making processes based on consensus, Ubuntu principles, or other non-Western governance models, you're practicing pluriversal politics. So I challenge those listening, look at your current organising. Where are you working within existing power structures? And where are you creating alternatives? Both have their place, but preparing for MAATUBUNTUMAN requires developing our capacity for pluriversal thinking and practice. When MAATUBUNTUMAN is fully realised, it will represent not just another pole in a multipolar world, but a fundamentally different approach to civilization, one based on Maat's principles of truth, justice, balance and harmony, rather than domination and competition. This contributes to what the Zapatistas call a world where many worlds fit, Ubuntu Dunia as a pluriversal rather than merely multipolar reality. This prefigures how MAATUBUNTUMAN would emerge with other peoples and nations as equals seeking justice, rather than as either isolated nationalists or dependent clients of external powers.
And how do these liberated zones address one of the historical challenges of Pan-Africanism, the tension between local community needs and broader continental unity? This seems like a practical question that contemporary movements must navigate.
This tension is addressed through what we call nested sovereignty, understanding that community self-determination and Pan-African unity are mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory. Local communities cannot achieve genuine autonomy while global systems of exploitation remain intact. While Pan-African unity cannot be meaningful if it doesn't embrace local community well-being. Liberated zones practice this integration by ensuring that broader political goals serve community needs rather than substituting for them. For example, when the Alliance of Sahel States nationalises mining operations, the goal isn't just continental pride or even regional pride, but ensuring that resource extraction serves local development rather than external enrichment.
This connects to what seems to be the fundamental principle of Maat Ubuntuman, that unity must enhance rather than diminish local autonomy and cultural diversity.
Yes, and I guess in an African context, that sense of local autonomy is really translocal or transnational, and it's global at the same time. So MAATUBUNTUMAN envisions what we might call unity in diversity, recognising that African people have developed diverse cultures, languages and governance systems that represent adaptations to different environments and historical experiences. Unity means coordinating these diverse strengths rather than homogenizing them. This is why the vision draws from multiple African philosophical traditions rather than imposing a single model. Maat, Ubuntu represent different but contemporary approaches to organizing human relationships that can enrich each other through integration.
Preparation for Maat Ubuntuman. Throughout our discussion, you've emphasized that Maat Ubuntuman requires preparation in the present rather than waiting for ideal conditions. How does this connect to our podcast's central theme of Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves for reparations?
Preparing for Maat Ubuntuman is preparing for reparations in its most comprehensive form, because Maat Ubuntuman represents the ultimate expression of African self-determination. All of our preparation work must orient towards building the consciousness, the skills, capacities, and most importantly, the institutions needed for realizing Pan-African unity. This means that everything from how we conduct Maatso as Ajuras to how we organize campaigns for even recognition of the Maangamizi and the requirement to stop it must be evaluated against the question: does this advance our capacity for unified action? Are we building the trust, the communication systems, and shared analysis needed for MAATUBUNTUMAN?
This seems to require what Paulo Freire called critical consciousness, the ability to analyze current conditions while envisioning transformation. How do communities develop this dual capacity for both critique and vision?
Critical consciousness emerges through what we call praxis. That is the integration of reflection and action that allows communities to understand their conditions while building the power to change them. Pan-African Reparations Rebellion groundings create structured spaces for this praxis by combining historical education, analysis of current conditions, and strategic planning for advancing Maat Ubuntuman. This isn't just intellectual work, but transformative practice that develops the collective capacity needed for unified action across differences of geography, class, gender, and other factors.
How does this vision of Maat Ubuntuman help movements avoid the trap of pursuing reforms that might actually delay or prevent the comprehensive transformation required?
Having Maat Ubuntuman as our strategic horizon helps distinguish between reforms that build towards unity and those that reinforce fragmentation. For example, initiatives that encourage African countries to compete against each other for foreign investment work against Maat Ubuntuman, while initiatives that build regional cooperation and resource sharing advance it. This is why the Stop the Maangamizi campaign emphasizes transformative rather than reformist reparations. Individual compensation without structural change might temporarily alleviate suffering, but could actually stabilize the systems that produce the suffering if it doesn't build towards collective power and unity.
The concept of cognitive justice that you've mentioned in previous episodes seems particularly relevant here. The idea that different knowledge systems must be recognized and integrated rather than having Western knowledge dominate.
Yes. Cognitive justice is fundamental to Maat Ubuntuman building because African unity cannot be achieved through Western conceptual frameworks that emphasize competition and domination. Preparing for Maat Ubuntuman requires reclaiming and developing African knowledges that emphasize cooperation and complementarity. This is why organizations working towards Maat Ubuntuman prioritize education that centers African languages, philosophies, and approaches to understanding the world. We cannot achieve unity using the same thinking that created our fragmentation.
Now, you've mentioned several times that preparation is key to realizing Maat Ubuntuman. For our listeners who feel inspired but perhaps overwhelmed by the scale of this vision, how would you suggest they begin their preparation journey?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this, Brother Simeon, because transformation always begins with individual commitment that becomes collectivized or turns into collective action. I want to offer those listening a very practical framework for beginning their preparation journey right now. Start with what I call the 3 circles of preparation. The inner circle is personal transformation, developing your own consciousness and practices. The middle circle is community building, connecting with others who share this vision. The outer circle is systemic action, challenging the structures that prevent the realization of MAATUBUNTUMAN. For the inner circle, I challenge those listening. Choose one African philosophical concept to study deeply this month. Maybe it's Ma'at. Spend time each day reflecting on how truth, justice, balance, harmony apply to your current situations. Or maybe it's Ubuntu. Practice seeing how your decisions affect your family and community's well-being. For the middle circle, identify 3 other people in your area who might be interested in learning about Maat Ubuntuman. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Start conversations over meals. Invite people to watch documentaries about the Alliance of Sahel States together. Create informal study circles. And for the outer circle, choose one system that affects your daily life. Maybe it's your workplace, your child's school, your neighborhood association. And ask yourself, how could this operate more according to the principles of Ma'at? What small experiment could you try to introduce more consensus-based decision-making or mutual aid practices?
And Auntie Esther, how might somebody looking to enact this actually throw it into operation?
Okay, so maybe start with developing some deep knowledge of African history, philosophy, and contemporary liberation movements. We cannot build what we cannot envision, and we cannot envision what we do not understand about our own history or our story, our own traditions, as well as their contemporary possibilities. So I challenge those listening to reflect on what African philosophical tradition from your own lineage or ancestral region can you study, learn more about this month. How can you connect that knowledge to contemporary organising in your community? Second, practice the principles of Ma'at and Ubuntu and other African value systems. There's the Nguzu Saba that is often spoken a lot about in our community. Maat Ubuntuman will not emerge automatically from external conditions, but must be cultivated through disciplined practice of the values and relationships that it requires. So ask yourself in your next community meeting, how can you centre Ma'at, truth, justice, balance, harmony? How can you ensure that decisions reflect Ubuntu, the understanding that we are because we are together? Third, build connections across the artificial divisions that separate us as a people. Whether the divisions are geographic, whether they're national, whether they are class-based or ideological, or they're based on our sex. Or preparing for MAATUBUNTUMAN means practicing unity in our current struggles. So this week, reach out to African organisations or organisers in other cities, countries, continents. Learn about their work. Share your own experiences. begin building the networks that Maat Ubuntuman will require. And fourthly, you can support liberated zones that are emerging, like the Alliance of Sahel States, while also building autonomous institutions in your own communities. Let's look to do for self. Maat Ubuntuman emerges from the expansion and the connection of these spaces rather than abstract planning. What autonomous institution can you help establish in your area? How can you create a Maat Ubuntu Jama, that is a community, literally Pan-African or African heritage communities that are learning to be the reparatory justice change that we seek, or their equivalent on the continent of Africa, known as Sankofahomes? And how can we do so in ways that best serve our community, while also connecting to other such Maat Ubuntu Jamas or Sankofahomes? Finally, remember that Maat Ubuntuman is not just about African people, but about our contribution to global civilization building and transformation. We prepare effectively for Maat Ubuntuman by demonstrating that African unity enhances rather than threatens the well-being of all humanity. How can your organising model the principles of multipolar cooperation and mutual respect that Ubuntu Dunia, which is the anti-imperialist, multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice that is going to be catalysed by not only the African struggle, but other peoples who've been colonised, their struggles for repair and transformation of the world?
So, if I be audacious enough, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Don't just listen to the podcast and move on to your next activity. Right now, before this episode ends, I want you to make a concrete commitment. Maybe it's reaching out to one person a week to start a conversation about African unity. Maybe it's researching one aspect of traditional African governance that you've never studied before. Maybe it's examining one area of your life where you can begin practicing Ubuntu principles. Whatever it is, make that commitment now. Write it down, share it with someone who will hold you accountable. Because Maat Ubuntuman becomes reality not through good intentions, but through committed action by conscious African people worldwide. And here's my challenge. After you take that first step, come back and listen to this episode again. I guarantee you'll hear things that you missed the first time, because you'll be listening with the ears of someone who has begun their own preparation journey rather than someone just learning about it. Remember, every ancestor we honoured in our libation had to take the first step, often without knowing how their actions would contribute to our freedom. Now, it's our turn to take steps whose full impact we may never see, but that absolutely contribute to the liberation of generations yet to come. As this vision of Maat Ubuntuman, as both specifically African and universally beneficial, seems to capture what Frantz Fanon meant when he called for the global South to create new concepts and new methods rather than simply imitating Europe.
Precisely. Maat Ubuntuman represents our response to Fanon's challenge, creating forms of human organisation based on African wisdom traditions while contributing to the transformation of global relations towards holistic justice and sustainability. This is the ultimate preparation work, developing our capacity to offer leadership in repair and global transformation, rather than remaining trapped in defensive responses to oppression. As we conclude this exploration of Maat Ubuntuman, We've seen how this vision represents the crystallization of centuries of Pan-African struggle into a concrete framework for comprehensive transformation. From the philosophical synthesis of Maat Ubuntu and recognition of African governance forms such as Oman, to the practical building blocks demonstrated by liberated zones such as the Alliance of Sahel States, MAATUBUNTUMAN provides both inspiration and strategic direction for our reparations work.
What emerges clearly is that MAATUBUNTUMAN isn't separate from but integral to reparations, representing the most comprehensive form of repair possible for the. This vision helps us understand that true preparation for reparations requires building towards unity rather than remaining trapped in the divisions that serve our oppressors.
Most importantly, MAATUBUNTUMAN demonstrates that Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves for reparations, must include developing our capacity for unified action across all the artificial boundaries that separate us as African people. Every Maat Ubuntu, every Pan-African Reparations Rebellion grounding, every campaign for recognition of the Maangamizi and its manifestations and the necessity to stop it must be evaluated against this ultimate goal of Pan-African unity.
These examples we've discussed, from the sovereignty movements in the Sahel to the autonomous organizing in the diaspora, show that MAATUBUNTUMAN isn't utopian fantasy, but emerging reality. Communities are already building the relationships, institutions, and practices that will characterize the Pan-African Union when it achieves full expression.
I encourage all of those listening to study the Maat Ubuntuman vision deeply, to study and reflect on it, to support liberated zones wherever they are emerging, not only on the continent of Africa but also in the diaspora, and to practice unity in your own organising. That is principled operational unity. But don't just study, act and reflect. Ask yourself, what concrete step will you take this week to advance Maat Ubuntuman in your community? How will you connect your own local organising to the global vision of Pan-African unity? Remember that every act of African cooperation, every initiative that builds our collective capacity, every challenge to the divisions imposed upon us advances this overall vision. The Alliance of Sahel States shows us that genuine sovereignty is possible when African people choose unity over the divisions imposed by colonialism. Their example provides both inspiration and practical lessons for the broader Pan-African unification that MAATUBUNTUMAN envisions. So I encourage you to research more on the Alliance of Sahel States further. Don't just look at YouTube videos. Learn about their specific policies, their challenges, and their victories. Consider how their model of building regional unity and Pan-African unity while maintaining local autonomy, or what we would call national autonomy in that context, can inform your own organising. And share this knowledge with others in your community.
Now this is
Esther Xosei
and Brother Simeon on behalf of the Maangamizi Educational Trust, reminding you that we can build towards MAATUBUNTUMAN. We are practicing Yɛresiesie. We are preparing ourselves for the most comprehensive reparations possible, the restoration of African unity and power. Also, thanks to Brother Daniel Kofi, our technical assistant, for all your support today.